Good morning, folks. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. It is October 6th. This is our weekly meeting. We have a full agenda ahead of us. In order to recognize our existence, we will start with a roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Ackerman.
Here.
Commissioner Bogue, Commissioner Cross.
Present.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Oath, Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 5 out of 7 commissioners present.
Great. Good to see everybody. Welcome to our weekly Zoom meeting. We start with commissioner comments. Does any commissioner have comments for the good of the cause? Commissioner Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make the commission aware that I had a conversation last week with one of the operators in the state about a project that they're hoping to try and get some federal funding on and looking into, and it's related to carbon capture and sequestration. And so at this point in time, I think it's worth saying that they've got some potential funding from the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy seems very excited about the project and kind of working on a pilot program to try and do some Class 2 wells initially, and then moving those over to Class 6 wells with permanent sequestration of carbon in the future. And so I just wanted to make the commission aware of that and kind of let you know that at some point in time, we may want to get more information on the project as well.
You're muted.
Thank you for that comment. Other comments from commissioners? All right, seeing no further comments, we move to public comment. I believe that Ms. Christensen signed up as a public commenter. Let's bring her into the house and we will hear from her for 3 minutes.
Oh, hi, thanks. Sorry, it's kind of a crazy morning. Good morning. I'm Kate Christensen. I am with 350 Colorado. I live in Lafayette, and I've been trying to dig in per recommendation from the commissioners into mission change rules, which I was deep in another job in pandemic parenting during mission change, so I was not a part of that rulemaking process. So I have been digging into the rules, and I have a question about them. So one rule, one of the things I'm worried about with caps is that all the OGDPs will be fast-tracked once all the caps are approved. And I've been told that is not the case, that every OGDP will be submitted separately. That doesn't necessarily mean it won't be fast-tracked. And I found from this fact sheet, I'm just going to read it from the 600 series, the Safety and Facility Operations Regulations. Expands protective setbacks for schools and homes to 2,000 feet. The 2,000-foot setback to buildings, except for when protective measures are in place and the commission approves. This includes 4 off-ramps. And A, the well location is already within an improved comprehensive drilling plan or comprehensive area plan. So here's my question for commission. If we're looking at all these caps, which is drilling, like for example, the Guanella cap is 14 years worth of drilling in Weld County. So this means all the development, all the home sales and changing of hands of property owners, anybody, and then the upcoming OGDPs, like maybe it's approved in a cap, and then they apply for the OGDP, and the resident who maybe the homes have been built now or properties have changed hands, the 2,000-foot setback no longer applies because the cap's been approved. And I'm just wondering if I'm reading this right. Because if I'm reading this right, we're saying we're taking away kind of any of the good work that SB 181 has done for all these like potential next decade people. I mean, we're going to have like Collier Hill on our hands over and over and over again. And, you know, the Longs Peak OGDP, but if that were happening under a cap, it wouldn't have been denied. So I'm just wondering if I'm reading it correctly and that we're agreeing that once these caps are approved, all of those OGDPs, the 2,000 foot setback rule doesn't apply. That's my question.
Okay, Ms. Christian, the one thing that the commission doesn't do is try to answer sort of questions on the fly. But
Okay.
we'll take your question and we will submit it to the attorney generals, and we will get a response so that we can provide you with a timely response to your question.
Is it possible to do that before the box elder gets approved? Because that hearing,
Well,
I think, is
number
early
one,
November.
there's no presumption box elder will be approved one way or another.
Before the box elder hearing. Sorry, thank you. Sorry for
hearing that's coming up. I will instruct the AAGs to get back to us ahead of that hearing. How's that?
That would be awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you for being attentive to our process. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for your time, as always.
Okay. At this time, we will continue with our agenda. I believe that next up is the consent agenda. Does any commissioner have questions with regard to consent? Seeing no questions, do we have a motion to approve consent?
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Commissioner McGowan, second by Commissioner Cross. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of consent signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Consent carries. All right, continuing, we will now take up docket number 2109-00157, Noble Energy's OGDP number 2. And we first will, it looks like on our agenda that first we're going to hear from Noble. Does that mean that we do not have a Mr. Maxey presentation?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Maxey unfortunately was not able to be with us today due to commitments he had in with his
the
board.
Energy and Environment Symposium this morning.
Correct.
So.
And Mr. Maxey should have provided comments on this OGDP. I believe they're in the hearings file. I'll double check as we get our panelists in and circulate that to everyone.
All right, I'm looking real quick. Hold on. All right, I don't see his comments, but if you find them, let me know and we can read them into the record.
Okay.
So with that, Ms. Fulcher, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, Commissioners. Great to see you all this morning. We do have a PowerPoint presentation for you again today, so you give us just a minute to make sure that you're seeing that. I'm not seeing it yet on my screen. All right, looks like we've got it up and running for you. All right, once again, Commissioners, my name is Jill Fulcher, and I'm with the law firm of Beatty and Wozniak here today on behalf of Noble Energy in docket 2109-00157, which is an application for approval of the Oil and Gas Development Plan 2 and the Wells Ranch Comprehensive Drilling Plan. I'm joined again by my colleague Jim Martin, along with Ryan Antonio, Mo Montoya, and Doug Dennison of Noble Energy. And again, we've got several panelists with us today to answer your questions following today's presentation. You heard a considerable amount of testimony last week in reviewing OGDP 1 that will also be applicable to today's docket. For example, the community outreach efforts, the open houses, the direct contacts and engagements with those owners within 2,000 feet of proposed locations, the facility designs, all of that is going to carry over and be applicable to today's matter. So where we can, we will try to move more quickly through some of that information that's repetitive. Let's move to the first slide, Patricia, the map. There we go. So again, I know this at this point, 3 weeks in, the commission is very well acquainted again with this map of the Wells Ranch Comprehensive Drilling Plan. So I won't spend a lot of time on this map. I do want to simply just point out where we are focusing today's discussion. Again, last week, you reviewed and approved OGDP 1, which is in the bottom left corner of this map. And again, in the southernmost portion of the comprehensive drilling plan. Today, we're moving a little bit further east, but again, in the southern portion of the Wells Ranch CDP with OGDP 2. And then next slide, please. And then this is a zoomed in look at what we refer to as priority area 1 of the Wells Ranch CDP. So with OGDP 1, which you approved last week, and then OGDPs 2, 3, and 4, this area makes up about a third of the total comprehensive drilling plan development. So again, today we're focusing on OGDP 2, and then I believe next Thursday we'll be talking about OGDPs 3 and 4. Let's move to the next slide. All right, here's where we're going to get into a dive and overview of OGDP 2. This oil and gas development plan requests approval to develop 3,600 mineral acres covering all or portions of sections 10 through 15 of Township 6 North, Range 64 West, and all or portions of sections 7, 8, 17, and 18 of Township 6 North, Range 63 West. OGDP 2 proposes developing this acreage with 17 new horizontal wells within 2 approved existing drilling and spacing units from 2 multi-well pads into a consolidated single production facility. Again, like OGDP 1, we're asking for reduced downhole setbacks so that the treated interval will be 200 feet from the heel and toe of the unit boundary, and then 300 feet from the lateral portion of the wellbore. Again, evidence is in the record supporting this technical request, and this request has been noted for approval by staff, or supported by staff in the director's recommendation. Just like last week, you'll notice the well pads and the facility are located in close proximity to each other. Again, we talked about it last week. This is the operational corridor approach to development. So what we're trying to do here is minimize as best we can impacts to the surface, impacts to the environment, to wildlife, and to our residents by limiting the number of well pads to technically access the minerals, and then also limiting everything to production from a single facility. Each of the proposed locations in OGDP 2 did trigger one or more criteria under Rule 304B. So a thorough alternative location analysis was conducted and included in your materials. Just a few items to note: the A1207 facility and the A1210 pad, which you see labeled here, both have residential building units within 2,000 feet of the disturbed area. But there are no homes inside of 500 feet within this OGDP, so informed consent was not required under Rule 604A4. Each of these locations was included in the comprehensive drilling plan, and so Rule 604B applies, as was noted in the director's recommendation. I do want to note that with respect to the A1202 pad, there are 0 homes within 2,000 feet. Each of these locations is within high priority habitat for pronghorn. That is the case throughout OGDP 2. The entirety of these lands are going to be mapped as high priority habitat for pronghorn. And then the A1210 and the A1207 locations are near to the Greeley Canal. So you're going to hear some testimony related to Bnps on both of those topics. Just like OGDP 1, the response from our residents has been very overwhelmingly positive for this development. We've had direct contact with 100% of the residents within 2,000 feet of these locations. We included a summary of those contacts and touch points within the appendice of your materials today, and we can certainly speak to that if you care to following today's presentation. Just like OGDP 1 as well, the final point on this slide, OGDP 2 will yield significant additional cumulative beneficial impacts here. You heard about our legacy wells last week. This area is very similar. There were 89 legacy wells that will be plugged and removed following this program. And we've got some maps for you today of where those legacy wells exist. They are throughout the entire portion of this OGDP. So many of those legacy wells are coming within 2,000 feet or less of homes. Those will be plugged and removed. And then again, as I mentioned, this entire area is within high priority habitat for pronghorn. And so we really see a net positive for wildlife in this area because we're going to be removing and reclaiming about 114 net acres of land here. So we're returning that back to original vegetative state, again, to hopefully create positive benefits as we see it for wildlife because we're increasing their room to roam here. Let's go to the next slide, please. Notice of OGDP 2 was provided to all interested parties, including residents and tenants within 2,000 feet of these proposed locations, and no petitions against approval of this OGDP were filed. Public comment was open for a period of 60 days, with only one comment being received by a member of the general public. This was not a commenter within 2,000 feet of the proposed location, and as best we can tell as well, not even within the OGDP per se, just a member of the public that did comment about concerns related to high priority habitat and the Greeley Canal. So those concerns were responded to by Noble and by COGCC staff, and no additional response was required. Weld County has considered each of these locations as part of that comprehensive WOGA process you heard about last week. And as Mr. Maxey noted, in December 2019, that WOGA was approved, and what he had stated last week, that means the locations are set, and those locations and that permit approval is recorded in the county. Again, Noble will commit to coming forward with Weld County to submit site-specific forms as part of that WOGA process closer to the time of construction. The locations are not within 2,000 feet of schools, childcare centers, high occupancy residential building units, public water systems, and are not within disproportionately impacted communities. And again, as I said, each location is within high priority habitat for pronghorn, but it is impossible to avoid this habitat entirely, again, just based on the prevalence in this area. Finally, we did want to note on this slide that the director has issued a recommendation for approval. A few findings to note. There's a finding that all locations meet with siting requirements of Rule 604. The director has reviewed and supports CPW's waiver of Rule 1202A3 with respect to storage equipment. And then finally, there is a finding that the proposed plans and BMPs will work to reduce and minimize impacts to wildlife and to residents. Let's go to the next slide. So this will be the final slide from me. We did want to note that the director's recommendation lists 4 recommended conditions of approval for your consideration today. And what we want to say at the outset, if it pleases the commission following today's presentation and your deliberations, if you want to adopt these conditions of approval, Noble is supportive of these conditions being made part of your order. We did have some small tweaks to the language regarding condition of approval number 3, which relates to some of the wildlife timing stipulations. What we've done here, and we've talked about this in advance with commission staff, I believe commission staff is supportive of these changes. Primarily what we did is we worked to limit the scope of the work that will be avoided during that January 1st to April 30th timeframe to pre-production activities. In staff's original draft language, it was open to oil and gas operations. And as you know, that's a defined term in your rules. It's very broad in scope. And what we didn't want to do was prohibit without consultation certain activities that are necessary to just maintain safe operations at the wells and at the facility. So if workovers need to happen, or if other well maintenance operations need to happen, we want to make sure that we're not limiting those operations from occurring, so we can make sure that the pads in the facility are running safely, because that is the goal number 1. And then the other thing is we want to make sure we can still come out and plug and abandon those older legacy wells during this time frame, because a big part of retiring and accelerating the retirement of those legacy wells is having a year-round time frame to do that work. So again, we made a change to the scope. And then again, what we did is if these activities cannot be avoided during that time frame, staff's proposed language is that we would come back to the director for additional consultation, review of the wildlife mitigation plan to determine if additional BMPs or mitigations are necessary. We support that as well. We just wanted to make clear that if the director believes no adjustments are needed, that we don't need to resubmit the wildlife mitigation plan if nothing changes. And again, my understanding is that staff is supportive of that language, and I'm sure they're going to be here to speak to that as well. So that concludes my portion of the walkthrough today. Again, we appreciate your time. Now 3 weeks running, and so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan Antonio.
Thank you, Jill. Good morning, commissioners. My name is Ryan Antonio, Surface Land Manager for Chevron, and I'll be covering the community outreach and alternative location analysis portion of the presentation. Next slide. As mentioned previously, planning efforts began for OGDP 2 back in 2018. Once the recommended locations were identified, Noble held 2 open houses at the Eaton Community Center in June of 2019 and May of 2022. All residents inside the entire CDP area were invited, including all residents within 2,000 feet of the recommended locations of OGDP 2. Noble mailed out invitations to each resident took an additional step by contacting each owner to encourage attendance. Also, follow-up calls were made to address any outstanding concerns or questions. The community was very supportive of this project due to the plug and removal of the existing legacy wells and facilities in the area. In fact, the largest organic dairy operator in the area was very supportive of the project due to the wells and facilities being plugged, but also the reclamation of roads and elimination of associated truck traffic within their fields and operations areas. Overall, we have strong support for this project from the community, as this high level of engagement resulted in 0 applications for intervention and petitions opposing the project. As an additional note, we included slides demonstrating our engagement with residents within 2,000 feet of the recommended locations of OGDP 2 in the appendix of the slide deck. Next slide. As I mentioned last week, our main concerns by residents were primarily related to traffic, timing, plugging and removal, noise, light, and dust, as well as impacts to agriculture. Due to the operations corridor approach to planning, we were able to address these concerns by utilizing pipeline infrastructure for takeaway and plugging and removal of wells, facilities, and also BMPs such as sound walls and lighting plans to mitigate these concerns. Next slide. I would like to briefly reemphasize Noble's planning efforts with Weld County. As mentioned, OGDP 2 has gone through a full 1041 WOGLA hearing. The hearing officer approved the locations on December 12, 2019, and the final order was filed in public record on December 20th of 2019. Next slide. This slide shows you an overview of OGDP 2. As you can see, our recommended locations are in the center of 2 spacing units of the target minerals area and are shown in green. The alternative location analysis before you today represents our evaluation of the area during the planning period of this project back in 2018 and into 2019. The main goal of this project is to produce all 17 wells covering 3,600 mineral acres into a single production facility. As part of the strategic planning process of the Wells Ranch CDP and the associated OGDPs within, locations of well pads and production facilities have been geographically aligned in proximity to each other as part of the operational corridor. This alignment minimizes surface disturbances to residents and wildlife while maximizing the ability to access pipeline infrastructure. The operational corridor requires pads and facilities to be near each other to be successful. As shown, all locations with the ability to access the target minerals were evaluated. A quick overview of the challenges in this development area include the wetlands areas to the east and to the west, organic farms that are located to the west, and to the east, there's a major irrigation reservoir and associated wetland with potential wildlife concerns. Also, there are several large organic dairies on the west and north sides or obtaining a surface use agreement would not be possible. If the alternative locations had been selected, there would have been additional disturbances and impacts to receptors, longer flow lines and stranded minerals, and in some cases, additional facilities would have been required due to the exceeding flow line limitation standards. Ultimately, the benefits of the operation corridor would not have been achievable. Also, as a follow-up to a comment made in the director's recommendation, Noble did consider combining the A1202 pad with the A1210 pad, but chose not to do so because of the additional pad area needed for construction and associated topography issues. If the pad were to be expanded, there'd be a 17-foot drop in elevation to the south, where Noble would need to bring in a significant amount of material, resulting in additional disturbance in construction. The landowner was also not agreeable to expand the pad, as it would disrupt the farming and irrigation of the field and be located closer to his home. The recommended A1202 was selected due to the minimal surface impacts and it being located at an existing oil and gas well and facility site located outside of the field. I would also like to highlight that Noble originally selected AL number 1 for this development. After further review, the wells were relocated to the A1210 pad to minimize impacts to nearby RBUs and minimize surface disturbance. I want to point this out as an example of Noble's efforts to consolidate and minimize impacts where possible. Overall, the recommended locations before you today best meet the COGCC's mission of protecting public health, safety, welfare, environment, and wildlife resources, and I plan to go through that with you for OGDP2 in more detail. Next slide. I plan to go over all 3 recommended locations and the associated alternative locations in this one slide. The recommended A1207 facility, the A1202 well pad, and the A1210 well pad all contribute to a consolidated surface disturbance footprint. They allow for safe development of the target minerals and protect and minimize minimize adverse impacts to people and the environment. All wells in OGDP2 will produce into the A1207 facility. AL1, AL3, AL4, and AL5 all have more RBUs within 2,000 feet. AL1 would have 1 RBU within 500 feet, and AL3 would have 3 RBUs within 500 feet. AL5, 8, 9, and 10 would each require at least an additional 10 acres of surface disturbance for an additional well pad to develop the target minerals safely. AL5 and 6 would also require an additional well pad and longer flow lines to recover the target minerals and would require an additional surface disturbance of approximately 14 acres. AL6 would require significant expansion of an existing farm road and about a half a mile of new road entering and exiting near 3 RBUs. AL4, AL5, AL7, and 11 are also within an organic field. Operations not associated with organic farming could compromise the organic certification and the existing contractual obligations of the farm. All alternative locations are within HPH for pronghorn winter concentration area. AL8, AL9, AL10, and AL12 are also within or in close proximity to other wildlife resources, such as burrowing owls or bald eagle active nest sites. After considering all locations as part of the extensive alternative location analysis, Noble believes that the consolidated configuration of the 2 recommended well pads into 1 central production facility for OGDP2 is the most protective of public health, safety, welfare, environment, and wildlife resources. The recommended locations allow for the development of the target resources across 3,600 mineral acres with minimal surface disturbance. The recommended locations have also been sited away from reservoirs, schools, towns, subdivisions, while taking into consideration local agricultural operations. Thank you for your time allowing me to run through this. I'll pass it over to Mo Montoya to discuss facility design evolution.
Thanks, Ryan. Good morning, commissioners. My name is Mo Montoya, and I'm the Regulatory Compliance Manager for Chevron's Colorado assets. As you heard last week, our teams work hard to accomplish three things: safer operations, a smaller footprint, and lower emissions. Our new facilities result in a reduction of impacts due to pipelines, power infrastructure, and the operations corridor that support responsible and efficient operations. Next slide, please. On this slide, we'd like to highlight what surface facilities will look like in OGDP2. The current production facility design being used by Noble's Rockies business unit has the goal of realizing safer operations, a smaller footprint, and lower emissions. Just as we reviewed last week, the picture on the left represents a legacy design, and the picture on the right shows the most recent design, which will be used across the Wells Ranch CDP and OGDP2. We believe that the facility in OGDP2 embraced the Commission's mission of protection of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. We accomplish this by completely eliminating the need for flares and enclosed combustors, by the removal of all oil and water production tanks from our sites, eliminating millions of miles of truck traffic over the life of the project. All major equipment is electrified, and at a distance of 500 feet, as we said last week, our facility has the same noise level as the average refrigerator running in a home. We use instrument air to power our pneumatics, removing additional methane sources. The facilities are equipped with extensive automation safety systems that continuously monitor operations on site, and all locations are monitored 24/7 from our control room in Greeley. We talked about spec oil leaving our sites. I want to be clear, this is how we're able to remove oil and produce water tanks, not only from our facilities, but this product does not require a central gathering facility for further processing. If we have production upsets, we shut in our facilities where other operators might go to tanks to keep producing. Next slide, please. Before I jump into this, I did want to clarify a comment we had on the record last week. While we always intend to pipe oil and gas from our facilities, the facility evolution is made possible by comprehensive planning and our operations corridor. To say it plainly, CDP and the long lead permits allow us to build the oil and gas pipelines and power infrastructure to utilize this style of facility. As stated in the Wells Ranch finding of suitability, had Noble elected to file individual Form 2As for the 50 oil and gas locations and individual Form 2s for the 512 wells instead of proposing a CDP, the CDP area would not have had the benefit of landscape level planning. Through landscape level planning, staff and Noble worked first to avoid impacts and then minimize adverse impacts to development, to persons, the environment, and wildlife. These benefits would not have been immediately or potentially ever attainable had Noble pursued traditional individual well pad development. Moreover, during the permitting phase, Noble will be required to avoid, if not possible to avoid, mitigate impacts consistent with Commission rules. So let's talk about what this means for OGDP2 versus our existing legacy operations today in the same operational area. When developed, OGDP2 will reduce our total footprint by around 75% versus operations today. We will consolidate from 17 legacy production facilities to one, which means 115 acres of producing minerals are gathered to just one single location. We have removed all production tanks, use pipelines instead of trucks to get our product to market, removed all flaring, and significantly increased our operations oversight and lowered our emissions by 90%. Again, our team goals are safer operations, smaller footprint, lower emission, all resulting in the reduced impact to our operations. Next slide, please. Again, as we testified to last week, traditional flowback was a temporary facility set up on pad to remove water and sand early in the phase of our oil and natural gas production. Our newest approach allows for the elimination of all temporary kit, eliminating all uncontrolled emissions, truck traffic, noise, and dust from this part of our operation. The flowback goes directly to the facility, which again is electrified, has no flares, and goes directly to pipeline, resulting in zero uncontrolled emissions. Next slide, please. As we mentioned last week, we do everything we can to electrify our operations. OGDP2 is 100% an XL energy service area. We've partnered with them extensively on OGDP1. And on this project, again, we're happy to report that we have full confidence that both the production facility and the drill rig will be electrified. Next slide, please. As we outlined last week, 303A5B provides quantitative and qualitative data to evaluate incremental adverse and beneficial contributions to cumulative impacts caused by an OGDP. We've gone through a landscape level planning for this OGDP and identified, again, the three similar driving forces contributing not only to offsetting and mitigating adverse cumulative impacts, but also promoting beneficial cumulative impacts. Those are plugging and removing of existing operated and non-operated legacy wells, the implementation of technologically advanced completion and production design, and going beyond compliance to enhance ecosystem restoration and land conversion back to vegetative states. Next slide, please. OGDP2 will remove 89 legacy locations along with their emissions and the land footprint of 555 wells throughout the total approved CDP. You can see from the table in the lower right that this shows a decrease in emissions by removing these sites and providing new, less emitting modern facilities. The result of this is a reduction of 90 tons per year of VOCs and 35 tons per year of NOx. Next slide, please. As I mentioned in my testimony last week, traditional oil and gas operations, we tend to see around 1,700 trips per year per location for oil hauling and an additional 1,700 trips per year for water hauling. This new facility and its pipelines and zero production tanks will result in a reduction of over 293,000 truck trips, over 6.6 million miles of road traveled, and a reduction of 20,000 tons of CO2. Next slide, please. This next slide is just a summary of the two slides that we've just spoke about for your consideration. Next slide. OGDP2 development and reclamation represents, again, 7-fold increase in land return. With the removal of these 89 wells, we will return 114 acres to natural habitat for landowner use. This means more pronghorn and agricultural habitat for the people and the wildlife of Colorado. As I testified to last week, we would be required to reclaim this acreage in the future, but this new development allows us to accelerate the return of this land to productive use outside of oil and gas operations. OGDP2 will yield back a very large legacy acreage position back to productive use that is equivalent to around 114 2,500 square foot homes. Next slide, please. Bnps, as I talked about last week, we have a long operations history in Colorado, and we believe that we've developed what we believe to be some best-in-class Bnps. We've included, again, the same or very similar pages with our Bnps, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions, but again, I just wanted to highlight a couple categories. Noise, again, we do everything we can to avoid noise impacts. We're planning to use our quiet frac fleet equipped with Tier 4 engines in OGDP2. And as we mentioned, the elimination of almost all truck traffic during the production phase. Aside from sound walls, we also plan to use additional point source mitigation panels to reduce specific areas, noisier areas such as the shakers on the rigs and other large sound generating sources on the frac crew. On emissions and odor, we're also committing to using Type 3 drilling fluid throughout OGDP2. Dust, we also only use fresh water sources when watering areas within 300 feet of an ordinary high water mark of any water body, and we ensure watering practices are not creating additional hazards on access roads such as slick or muddy conditions. One note on the CDPHE consultation. Again, one thing we're not able to commit to at this time are chillers, as chillers are primarily used in high pressure, high temperature environments during drilling operations to cool mud and protect downhole tools. The Wells Ranch CDP is not located in a high pressure, high temperature environment, and the additional energy associated and their emissions required to power chillers does not support their use at this time. Next slide, please. I did talk a lot about our noise mitigation strategies and our plans in OGDP1 last week, but I just wanted to reiterate that we do the same for OGDP2. The diagram you're looking at shows a model of a drilling rig that's mitigated and unmitigated, and along the bottom of the slide identifies decibel levels and some comparisons. As you can see from the diagram, by adding the sound walls, we're able to significantly reduce the decibels outside the sound walls. As shown on the right, we're also able to direct sound out and away from RBUs if needed. We're also going to use, again, those point source mitigation panels to further reduce on site. Next slide, please. This is a very similar model, but this is for our frac fleet. And again, the major takeaway that I would like everybody to take from these two slides is that we are going to use sound walls, and that our operations at 500 feet will be around the decibel levels of a living room to the conversation we're having right now. Next slide. Lastly, I wanted to remind the commission our lighting modeling and light mitigation plans that we do. This model shows sound walls and the light requirements for a drilling operation. You can see the lights modeled are contained within the sound walls, and we try to account for light to avoid having an adverse impact to receptors surrounding our operations. All of the light sources, with the exception of the derrick lights, are shorter than the sound wall height and will be contained therein. The derrick light, while higher or taller than the sound walls, will still be contained within the footprint of the sound wall. Thank you. Next slide. We did get a question last hearing about our air monitoring program, so I did want to provide a little bit of information on what we do on all of our pads going forward. All pads are equipped with a minimum of 3 air monitors for all drilling and production pads. All monitors are equipped with SUMA canisters and equipment to continuously monitor our air quality. If we have an exceedance on these monitors, we dispatch our leak and detection repair team to evaluate any issues and work with the operations staff to immediately mitigate issues. At the same time, SUMA canisters are sent off to the lab to identify the intensity of any released VOCs. And we transmit this data to the CDPHE monthly. All of these monitors are set 60 days before we commence drilling operations and remain on pad 6 months after wells are turned on. I will now turn it over to Doug Dedison to discuss our interaction with CPW and our wildlife mitigation plans.
Good morning, commissioners. As Mo said, my name is Doug Dennison. I lead regulatory affairs specialist for Chevron, and I'll be discussing the wildlife and related environmental issues associated with this OGDP. First, I'd like to thank COGCC and CPW staff, particularly Brandon Moret of CPW, for their continued willingness to address these issues in a constructive manner. As shown on this slide, we've actually had consultation ongoing for this OGDP for over the past 15 months. And just as a reminder, we originally filed this OGDP application in September of 2021 at a time when the staff of the agencies and the regulated community were still adjusting to the new rules and the needs of this commission. And even though we did submit our most recent wildlife plan submittals just in the last few weeks, we've had constant communication with both COGCC and CPW staff to refine our submittals as those staffs learn from their experiences with other OGDPs. As a result, I'm confident that all parties have a much better understanding of and agreement on the content of these submittals going forward. Next slide, please. For OGDP2, you've heard a lot about the Rule 1202D for high priority habitats, specifically the pronghorn winter concentration area, HPH. That's one of the primary wildlife issues we have in this OGDP, along with compliance with Rule 1202A3 related to new staging, refueling, or chemical storage areas within 500 feet of aquatic resources. The table on the bottom of this slide summarizes those issues for each of the proposed locations in OGDP2. As noted on this table, all 3 locations are within the pronghorn winter concentration area, HPH, and 2 of the locations potentially had activities subject to Rule 1202A3. Noble is committed to the compensatory mitigation outlined in the wildlife management plans for each location. We're committed to the proposed COA number 1 with the amendments Ms. Fulcher discussed. And CPW also provided waivers of the Rule 1202A3 requirement for both of the locations based on structural and operational BMPs committed to by Noble. As noted on this slide and as memorialized in the proposed COA, Noble's goal is to avoid pre-production activities inside of the timing limitations for the pronghorn winter concentration area, which is January 1st to April 30th. Next slide, please. However, as shown on this map of the entire Wells Ranch CDP, much of the acreage of this CDP is within this HPH, which makes it very challenging to schedule all such activities outside the timing limitations. As I've stated, our first goal is to avoid pre-production activities within the winter timing limitation. However, when we cannot avoid this timing limitation, Noble does agree to the proposed COA to address the circumstances. A few factors to keep in mind when assessing development within this HPH. First, to minimize the disruption and impacts to residents and wildlife in this area, it is advantageous for Noble to be able to develop this acreage in a methodical fashion so that the pre-production activities in one area are completed within a reasonable time frame without having to continually leave and return to the same area. We have experience with this more piecemeal approach to development in other nearby areas and have repeatedly heard from residents in those areas that they become fatigued with our operations dragging on over a long period of time, which creates impacts and stress for those neighbors that wouldn't have resulted if we would have completed all the work in one mobilization. Next slide, please. Secondly, and from the perspective of the Pronghorn Winter Concentration Area, the plugging and abandonment of the legacy wells and decommissioning of legacy facilities that will occur with this development will have an overall beneficial effect on wildlife. Not only will we be returning over 114 acres of disturbed land back to other uses, contributing to the defragmentation of the wildlife habitat, the truck traffic associated with servicing these legacy facilities will be eliminated, and our new production facility will not have truck traffic for transportation of fluids, which will result in far less impact to wildlife. Next slide, please. Similar to our discussions during OGDP 1 about how development of these new horizontal wells and elimination of the legacy wells and facilities will result in a beneficial impact to residents, these same activities will result in a beneficial impact to wildlife. This slide shows the legacy wells for all of Wells Ranch Priority Area 1, including OGDP in the lower right, in relation to the HPH. And you can see that the majority of the HPH within OGDP 2 is currently impacted by the existing legacy wells. Next slide, please. And this slide shows the same area after the legacy wells are removed and only the new well pads and facilities being proposed for OGDPs 1 through 4 are present. Additionally, Noble has proposed and is committed to numerous BMPs specifically related to wintertime pre-production operations in the wildlife mitigation plans approved by CPW. And as I've stated, we're committed to complying with COA number 1 to continue that communication as our development proceeds to address any issues that may arise. We believe our proposed development meets the intent of Rule 1202D as outlined in the statement of basis and purpose for that rule, which is to address the decrease in effectiveness of big game habitat that results from an increased density of oil and gas facilities. Our proposed OGDP 2 development and our entire Wells Ranch CDP development will result in a significant decrease in density of oil and gas facilities and the associated traffic and other impacts in this area, which will have a beneficial impact on wildlife and habitats. Next slide, please. Mr. Montoya described the numerous BMPs that Noble is committed to employing for this development, and I wanted to spend a few minutes going through some of the wildlife-specific BMPs. This table summarizes those BMPs in 3 categories: those that apply within the Pronghorn Winter Concentration Area, those that apply to locations that trigger Rule 1202A3, and those that apply to every location that Noble develops. The first category, those that we will employ within the Pronghorn Winter Concentration Area, regardless of the timing of those activities. As I've stated previously, Noble is committed to the proposed COA number 1 as amended and is committed to conduct further consultation with CPW and COGCC and implement additional BMPs and mitigation efforts that result from that consultation. Second category of BMPs are those that Noble is committed to employ on locations that trigger Rule 1202A3, and these BMPs form the basis of CPW's waiver of that rule. These BMPs are also detailed in the wildlife mitigation plans that Noble submitted to COGCC and CPW. And some examples of the things we will be doing: we will construct an earthen berm along the appropriate edges of locations to protect aquatic resources. We will have secondary containment that's constructed to comply with COGCC and other regulatory requirements. And then these locations will also be constructed with an engineered clay layer to further protect these resources. The final category of BMPs are those that Noble employs at every location we develop, regardless of its proximity to HPH or aquatic resources. These activities are ones designed to identify previously unknown issues, to ensure compliance with the multitude of wildlife and aquatic resource related regulations, and to minimize and mitigate the impact of our operations. These BMPs will allow Noble to comply with COA number 4 that was included in the director's recommendation. Thank you for your time this morning, and I'll now pass back to Jill Fulcher to summarize this OGDP.
Thanks, Doug, and thank you again, Chair and Commissioners, for your time and attention this morning and over the last few weeks. This concludes our substantive portions of the slides today. Just a couple of other items to reinforce or to mention. Again, not only was this OGDP noticed to all interested parties, but we did want to make clear that publication requirements were also met. So all procedural rules have been complied with respect to this docket. And also all substantive rules have been complied with respect to this docket. Again, the A1207 facility and the A1210 pad are cited in accordance with Rule 604B2. And then the A1202 pad is greater than 2,000 feet from any residential building unit. Just like OGDP 1, Noble has had the same direct contact and engagement with all of our residents in this OGDP, but especially with those folks that are coming within 2,000 feet of the 2 pads I mentioned. And everyone is very supportive, again, of this project for many of the reasons that Ryan mentioned earlier. Noble's locations in the facility will serve to protect and minimize impacts to receptors. Again, we're utilizing that modern flowback design and tankless production that's resulting in 0 uncontrolled emissions, utilizing bulk and test separation, again, minimizing surface footprint here, and then again, eliminating point source emissions, using that operational corridor approach to development. And you heard a lot from Doug just now about what that's going to do to limit that decrease in habitat, actually restoring quite a bit of habitat restoration in this area. And then finally, again, we're committing to electrification of the facility and the drill rig for this OGDP. And then again, you heard a lot about BMPs today that are further aimed to minimize and mitigate impacts to neighbors, to the environment, and to wildlife. All of this product and all of the oil, gas, and water will be piped from location. Again, that's thousands of truck trips that will not occur during the production phase. And then again, with retiring these older wells, that's a lot of truck trips currently happening now that will be eliminated. And then utilization of the quiet frac fleet to further reduce noise to wildlife and to our neighbors. Again, we're plugging and removing, or we will be plugging and removing a substantial portion of legacy wells here, 89 legacy wells that will be removed as a result of this project. Back of the napkin math, about 16 fewer wells than the OGDP you approved last week. But again, we're in a smaller acreage area here. So that's going to net about 114 acres back to original vegetative state. Finally, this OGDP is consistent not just with your rules, but with the CDP. Each of these locations and this plan was identified years ago and brought to the stakeholders at that time. And so was this mineral development. So it is consistent with your order. We do have Weld County's support for this project, and Weld County has approved these locations as part of its 1041 process. And again, we note that the director also recommends approval here today. So with that, we are here for questions. And again, thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you for the presentation. At this time, we do have an opportunity for commissioner questions to the panel. I also note that we have Mr. Moret from CPW with us. If any commissioner has questions with regard to the most recent changes on the wildlife BMPs. So with that, I'd open it up for questions. Commissioners. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the presentation. The visuals are, again, super helpful for me as a commissioner. It's kind of how my brain works. And I'm also going to apologize because I just got off of vacation, so I kind of have vacation brain as well. I'm wondering if Mr. Montoya can clarify for me. I feel like there's a lot of numbers that we're sharing related to emissions reductions and the different parts of these OGDPs in the priority areas. And I feel like in the cumulative impacts report, the tables are talking about a lot of different numbers of wells that are being plugged in the emission savings. So I just want to clarify. I feel like it was more clear in your presentation today about the savings that we're going to get from this OGDP area 2 and 89 wells. We're not talking about 128. And I feel like the cumulative impacts report that you submitted is related to 128 wells being P&A'd. And so I just want to be clear about what emission savings we're talking about from P&A'ing these legacy wells in this OGDP area 2. And I think it's what you presented today versus what's in the cumulative impacts report. And I apologize if I'm misunderstanding all the numbers that were in the report, but I think that that's what we should be submitting for cumulative impacts with staff. And I think I will ask for the same thing we asked last week, which is to work with staff on making sure that we're getting the right numbers so that we can reflect them in our annual cumulative impacts report.
Commissioner McGowan, thank you for that question. So I agree. I think that what we testified to today is the correct emissions impact reduction based on the 89 wells, is which in our last assessment, which was left in that area. And yes, we would be more than willing to commit. That's why we kind of put that summary slide of both of them, is because we anticipated and kind of welcome the fact that we can work with staff to provide that information to them. Did I answer your question, or is there more to it?
Yes, thanks. I just wanted, because again, I'm having a little vacation brain here. My second, I lost my train of thought now. Sorry, can you come back to me, Mr. Chair? It'll come to me.
For sure. Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Ackerman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it, and happy to cede the floor to Commissioner McGowan at any moment if she remembers where she's at there. First, I wanted to say to Noble, I wanted to commend Noble for its ongoing efforts, which are significant. They are not small in nature, and many of them were described here today. I think a lot of the things that were talked about here today are the result of our collective efforts to try to reduce emissions, reduce footprints, increase efficiencies. And I particularly appreciate the consolidation of facilities. I do think that's very helpful in many ways, as was pointed out very adeptly by Mr. Dennison. I especially appreciate the P&A'ing of 89 legacy wells, as was repeated a number of times here today. That is a significant step. And the restoration of 114 acres. And as a side note, agree with the non-assessment of indirect compensatory mitigation on OGDP2 for these reasons. I think, you've got density, and so that's compliance with our regulations, but also you have significant efforts for habitat restoration as well. And I do note, as was noted, that, ultimately Noble would be required to restore that habitat and had already agreed to do so, but an accelerated time frame is noted by me, and particularly for the purpose of consolidating facilities. That said, I do have a couple of questions for the operator, Mr. Chair, but I wonder if you know, I appreciate very much Noble working with CPW and with staff on a number of issues, and including the COAs. And I'm not sure if staff had an opportunity to review those before this presentation, and wonder if staff would be able to comment on their thoughts, since these were staff proposed COAs. I did agree with the staff proposed COAs, and with the modifications, I'd like to hear from staff or from Mr. Moret, whichever might be most appropriate, if you think that's appropriate, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So I know, oh, excuse me. I know we do have Mr. Moret on, and Ms. Larson, I might look to you to see if we would defer to staff or to Mr. Moret for a review of those.
Either one. I just wanted to note I did bring in Ms. Treats from staff, who would also be available to answer any questions. So both are available, and whoever would like to surface first and answer could certainly do so.
Hi, this is Rebecca Treats, OGLA, the lead OGLA for this OGDP for COGCC. So we have reviewed the changes that staff has no objection to the revised COA language that Noble proposed. We would like to put a brief reminder that our rules require additional information prior to an operator conducting operations involving the heavy equipment under Rule 312A, and for the plugging and abandonment of wells under Rule 435A2. So under Rule 312, the operator will submit and obtain director's approval of a Form 4 before conducting any subsequent well operations involving heavy equipment, except for routine well maintenance. This Form 4 is reviewed by staff, and part of that review is a consultation with CPW, especially if the location is in high priority habitat. Greg Geronlos spoke about this on September 13th in the operator meeting, but staff is happy to provide a link to that if needed, but just that does require CPW consultation. Also for Rule 435A2, the Form 6 for notice to intent to abandon, the director will review oil and gas locations where a well is located to ensure that necessary reasonable conditions of approval are applied to protect and minimize adverse impacts to public health, safety, welfare, and environment, and wildlife resources. So again, we as staff consult with CPW for any HPH that those wells will be in. So CPW will be consulted for both of these operations, and it does require for staff to have notice of these operations.
Thank you, Ms. Treats. That's very helpful. And if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Chair, if I could hear from Mr. Moret as well.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, commissioners and interested members of the public. My name is Brandon Moret. I am Colorado Parks and Wildlife's Northeast Region Energy Liaison. And just a couple of quick points. Yes, as Ms. Treats mentioned, that was the only portion of the COA that should remain in there as far as to continue to have CPW input. I noticed that they proposed in COA number 3, the second bullet, that they struck CPW from that, and that should remain in. And then my second point that I had that they didn't mention in their wildlife timing is that they will avoid the winter months for the pronghorn, but in Noble's second to last slide, they had some language in there that was less confident, if you will. They mentioned that they will strive when logistically possible. And I just want to say for the record to make sure that they will avoid the pronghorn winter season from January 1st to April 30th, even if it's not logistically possible. So that is all the comments I have, Commissioner Ackerman and Chair Robbins. Any other CPW related questions?
Thank you, Mr. Moret. That's all from me for now. And I wonder if Ms. Minerich could pull up the applicable slide with the COAs on there, if you would indulge me.
Yes, let's go ahead and do that. Mr. Ackerman, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. And this first one, I'm assuming that the red strikeouts there are suggestions by the operator to strike that language. And so COA number 3, sub 1, I'm having a hard time reading that. I would read it as it's written. The operator will, within CPW mapped pronghorn winter concentration areas, January 1 and April 30. And I'm having a hard time making sense of that. And so if I'm misreading that, or if the strikeout is not actually strikeouts, are they intended to remain? And that's my first question.
Who from the panel would like to take that question?
Chair, I can address this first. And appreciate that question, Commissioner Ackerman, because this isn't a strict, clean red line like you'd be typical of seeing, red lines coming in. What we did here is we struck what are substantive portions in the COA 3, but the language, what we're proposing is really in blue below. So that's the language to really focus in on reading. So yeah, apologies. This doesn't really read like a clean red line, but we just wanted to call out some of those significant changes. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you, Ms. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, Ms. Fulcher. And I would agree with the comments that were made by staff and by Mr. Moret that this is the appropriate language, that they will avoid construction drilling, and as is proposed here. So I also concur, and I concur with the comment to ensure that we have language in all of these that if there are touch points, that CPW is consulted during those touch points. And so I think it was under the COA number 4 that I can't quite see there, that we need to make sure that CPW is consulted during vegetation removal during that time period. That said, we can take that slide down. Thank you so much, Ms. Minarich. And I did have one other follow-up question, if I may. There was some discussion about electrification. Once again, as I started these comments, you know, the intent is to become cleaner, to become more efficient, and this is yet another way that Noble is trying to do that, is electrifying facilities, electrifying equipment. I noted that the drill rigs, it sounds like, will be able to be electrified, and the production facility electrified. Can you specify what won't be electrified, or what you're still trying to get electrified as part of this OGDP?
Thanks, Commissioner Ackerman. I think the real context of that question is as we move further through the CDP and we bring other OGDPs before you, and as we move into outside of the Excel area, we're still working with our energy provider to do that. So we're not trying to say, you know, only these parts of this will be electrified and not others. What we're trying to say is that this OGDP will be electrified, the facility and the drill rig. And then as we go through and have conversations, we're just trying to be cautious and not commit to the entirety of the CDP at this time, while we are attempting and working with Poudre Valley REA to make sure that that's possible. Is that the answer you're looking for, or would you like me to go deeper in there?
No, that's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Montoya. I appreciate that. And so, Mr. Chair, my final comment directed at the operator would just be thank you for addressing the winter pronghorn concentration areas directly in your presentation. Mr. Dennison, especially appreciate your comments. I think, to me, this is one of the difficult issues associated with this OGDP, and such was noted by you. There's a lot of pronghorn HPH here. I did want to note for the operator and for everyone on the line that, you know, in the end, avoidance during the winter timing stipulation periods in pronghorn winter concentration areas is very, very important to the well-being of pronghorn in Colorado, and that's why we talk so much about it. And so I appreciate you addressing that directly, and you know, hope to talk about that a little bit more during deliberations. So That's all I have right now. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and appreciate the panelists.
Thank you, Commissioner Ackerman. Great questions. Thanks to the panel for answering them. Further questions for the panel? Commissioner Messner, then Commissioner McGowan.
Commissioner McGowan, if you've remembered, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. This was similar to my comment with your other OGDP, which was there's a delay in between drilling and completions, and just making sure that there's updated communications with community, because I think some folks might think that you're done and then don't realize that you're going to come back almost a year later. I think if I'm looking at the schedule that was put into the application, and just making sure that those folks know you'll be coming back.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner McGowan, for that. So we will, these owners out here, the surface owners and the residents, we will call them with personal phone calls, and sometimes we'll send additional notice that's unrequired to them, so that they know when drilling operations are completed and completions comes in. We want to make sure that the community is well informed of what's going on, so they know what to expect. So yes, that will happen for sure.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a few questions and comments. So in the last OGDP number 1 for this particular CDPHE, there was discussion and actually language that was incorporated into the order in the end around moving forward the evergreen nature of the CDP approval and the timing of an evaluation of BMPs associated with these locations in a 3-year time frame. Unless I missed it, I didn't see that carry into this application, the similar language from the previous application. And it seems like that language would make sense to carry through any OGDP that's going to be associated with this CDP based on the discussion from the previous approval. I don't know if Noble had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Messner. You're right, we did not include that in our presentation as we were focusing in on the staff's recommended conditions of approval, but we did speak about that in advance of this hearing, and if the Commission wants to see that identical language incorporated in this OGDP order, Noble is supportive of that. We would just offer that it be identical to the language that was adopted last week. In particular, I think we have a date in that particular language of October 1st, 2025. And I think it would be simpler, probably for both sides, if we just stick to that date as the triggering event for reviewing BMPs. So, but yes, we will be supportive of that language being part of your final order should you decide to include it after deliberations.
I think that makes sense, and we might as well go ahead and think about next week and the next 2 OGDPs if we get to that point. But I think using the one date, if we're going there, makes sense as opposed to rotating by week or whatever it could be. Commissioner Messner, are you comfortable with that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I am. Thank you. I think one comment in here, I do appreciate the inclusion of some conversation around the air monitoring plan. That for this commissioner is important just to understand that, particularly in relation to siting of facilities within 2,000 feet of RBUs. And while I know the different air monitoring plans that Noble employs, I think that's an important part of a presentation so that people who aren't here every day hearing applications do understand that there is air monitoring that is being contemplated for these OGDPs. So thank you for that. I think I know the answer to this, but I just want to clarify it again because in the presentation on slide 27, there was an indication in there that there was an intent to use type 2 drilling muds, and in the conversation, it's been type 3 drilling muds, and so I just want to make sure that those things that everything's clear on that.
Yes, Commissioner Messner, thank you for that question.
Drilling fluid. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Drilling fluids, not drilling muds.
Yes, sir. And when our kind of standard BMP is that within 500 feet, we're going to use type 3 drilling mud. But when you look at OGDP2, we do have a building unit that is within, say, 800 feet. And we just thought it would be better to make that commitment rather than have that hard dividing line. And we also think it's the most protective when we have people kind of closer to those drilling facilities. So while our BMP kind of has that line, we thought it would be best just to commit because we think it is the most, it is sufficiently protective in this case.
Okay, thank you. And I think I'll follow up on Commissioner Ackerman's questions and comments, and I do think that it was more than just staff suggested COA number 4 that had a CPW strike through included in Noble's suggested COAs, and so I do think that anytime that CPW was not included in Noble's recommended COAs, that CPW needs to be reinserted there as an element in those COAs. And I appreciate Mr. Moret's comments that that avoidance really is the BMP here and is an important part of what we're trying to accomplish here around the protection of wildlife resources within a high priority habitat. And that even if an operator proposes to have activity within that timing stipulation of the high priority habitat antelope winter concentration range, that there may not be a BMP that would be sufficiently protective besides avoidance. And so I think it's important that CPW has the ability to make that determination on a site-specific basis, as things are being proposed. And so I think including CPW in that conversation is going to be really important there. I do acknowledge that there was a long timeline associated with consultation with CPW on this particular OGDP and the CDP in general. I guess I was a little confused as to why staff had to include a COA around this timing stipulations for the antelope winter concentration area versus having that as a standard piece of a BMP when proposing operations inside of a high priority habitat. And so that was a little bit of a head scratcher, but I'm appreciative that in the end that was included in the application. So I think that's the extent of my questions at this point, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you everyone for the presentation today. I just wanted to go over a couple things that were talked about. First of all, getting into the actual locations a little bit. How many wells are going to be drilled from each location, from each pad?
So from the A12-10 pad, there's going to be 10 wells drilled from that pad. And then for the A1202 pad, there's going to be 7 wells drilled from that pad.
Okay, and the consolidation that was discussed, is that consolidation at the 2 or at the 10, just so I'm clear?
Consolidation at the 10.
At the 10.
Yeah.
And you indicated that consolidation would not be feasible because of the additional surface size?
Yes, because if we were to consolidate all the wells onto the A12-10 pad, that would have required us to expand the location and there's surface constraints that surround that pad that wouldn't allow us to expand the pad with those additional wells. So we ended up selecting the A1202 as proposed for those 7 wells.
And can you just go over those constraints a little bit more? I know you talked about some of the farming, et cetera, but.
Yes, absolutely. So to the north, and I don't know, Patricia, if you want to put the aerial image up just for a visual reference. I think I saw it pop up for a second. I think we lost it. Okay, so the A1210 pad is the furthest pad there to the south. And so to the west, there's a property line there. So there's 2 different landowners. That's basically a fence line or property line on the very west side. And then on the north side, there's also a property line. And the surface owner wanted a little bit of a gap there so that they could access their fields. So those are the restrictions there. On the east side, you can kind of see it in the aerial. There is a canal that runs through there. So expanding to the east really isn't possible. And then to the south, you can see that building unit there to the southeast. Expanding to the south would kind of encroach on those other RBUs there that are noted in yellow. And there's also a significant elevation drop from the south portion of that pad, about a 17-foot drop in elevation there. So for all those reasons, we had selected the A1202, and you can't really see the A1202. It shows the recommended location there in green, but underneath that, there's a fairly large facility and a horizontal well there. So it's already an existing oil and gas location currently.
And so how much additional surface disturbance will there be on the 1202?
The A1202, I believe, I can double check. I believe that's a 6-acre or so drill pad on the A1202.
That's what's proposed, not it's currently at least interim reclamation on the 1202.
The current disturbance area. Is that where you're at, like for the existing location? Okay, yeah, I can clarify that. That's about 2 acres, probably 2 to 3 acres.
And all the wells are proposed to be drilled east-west on this location?
Correct, yeah, you can kind of see the OGDP2 kind of boundary is roughly 4 sections. And so these locations are located, around the center so that we can access, east and west, from the recommended locations as shown.
Okay. So unlike OGDP1, the issue with consolidation is not lengths of the kicks and some of the casing restraints that we had before. Here it's more so specifically the size of the actual surface available.
Correct, exactly.
And so on the proposed location, how close are the wells going to be to the borders of the pad as designed?
And you're referring to the A1210? The
1210, correct. So I'm just wondering, are those wells encroaching upon that elevation drop that you just discussed?
Well, the way they're situated now is they're in the pad area, and there has to be a distance basically from the edge of the well to the edge of pad or the disturbance area or working pad surface. Usually that's 250 to 300 feet, depending on the location. So the location that's presented here, allows for that consolidation of those wells onto that pad, but doesn't require us to expand it. Does that answer your question?
That does. That is helpful. And you also said initially that the alternative location 1 was your initial preferred location. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So our original plan with this project was to utilize AL number 1. And then the A1210, the A1207, and then also the A1202. So we were able to consolidate the wells on location AL number 1 to the existing A1210 pad.
To the limits, as long as it would keep it safe without without
Correct.
on the road and the, okay.
Yeah, and the main reason for that are those building units that are pretty close down there.
Okay. But no issues initially in terms of owner approval on ALA1. It was just more so to keep that distance.
Yes, correct. And we actually had a secured surface use agreement for that location. So our original plan was to select that one. And we did, we're always looking to consolidate where we can. And so we were able to consolidate one, but we didn't have enough room to consolidate the A1202.
Okay. And I appreciate that. And as was previously discussed, the ideas of consolidation, I think is important. And I think moving forward, I think it's also good to provide that kind of detail for the public as well as for the commissioners, just so we understand more what consolidation did occur, kind of what the specific limitations on consolidation are. Because I know as Commissioner Ackerman noted that, less surface disturbance and the consolidation and the steps you're taking are important steps to protect the public health, wildlife, and environment. And so I think that's important to know, kind of like what's to the north, what's to the west, and the east and the south there. And so I think that additional detail is helpful. I think that, a couple of my other questions were already addressed, including the evergreen language that Commissioner Messner talked about as well earlier. And so I will just say, I'm hoping moving forward that some of the information that was discussed both last week and this one and this week as well with the OGDP can be used in some of the presentations going forward and some of the submissions going forward as well, to make sure that we do have some of that detail. We're not kind of duplicating some of the comments and things like that as well, to make sure that we're on the same page with that. But aside from that, I wanted to especially because it was talked about in the recommendation, just get a little bit more understanding of why the consolidation wasn't possible, since it wasn't a feasibility issue like last week.
Yeah, if I might add, Commissioner Cross, my name's Tony Ball. I'm the land representative at Noble Chevron now, and we did discuss expansion of the A1210 with that surface owner, and it was important for him to leave some area there for his livestock and farming operations, and so he wasn't amenable to expanding that location as well.
I appreciate that. At this point in time, I think that's the only questions that I have, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Cross. Further questions for the panel? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm hoping this is my last question. I'm wondering if Ms. Fulcher can remind me what we decided last week regarding the schedule of the P&ing of the legacy wells, and just wanting to make sure that the benefit is it's happening faster than it might normally happen. And I know that, I guess, could you just remind me what language we came to agreement to, and if we are doing that again this time?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner McGowan. So the language that we struck, and I can pull it up and read it again into the record, but essentially what it did was commit to plugging and abandoning the legacy wells operated by Noble in each drilling and spacing unit within the OGDP upon initial production of the last horizontal well drilled in each OGDP. And so, like we said last week, we envision that a lot of this will happen before that time, but there could be some wells on the periphery of the unit where we need to wait to essentially plug and abandon those wells until certain horizontal wells are brought online. So that was the language we struck, and we'd certainly be comfortable with including that same language here. And, to Commissioner Cross's point, and I think some other commissioners today, we will address that again next week as well, but happy to include that same language here. And I can read that into the record, or I can work with AAG Mercer to make sure that that identical language is included in your final order.
Great. If the other commissioners are amenable, I would like that also included for this OGP as well. Thank you.
Great. Further questions? All right, I'm not seeing any further questions, so we will move into the deliberation phase of this matter before us today. If I've kept the notes correct, commissioners' questions and applicants' response include the CPW changes, the evergreen language that we agreed to last week, the clarification on the drilling muds, and the plugging and abandoning legacy well language. I think those are the 4 matters that I noted. Commissioner McGowan?
Sorry, did you include, I think we just need to make sure we have the updated, and I think they've already proposed that in their presentation. I just want to make sure we have the updated emissions estimates. And I think that's included. I think that was part of our discussion.
Mr. Montoya?
I just put my video on in case there was a question, but yes, the materials submitted today and our testimony today is the updated, and we'll work with staff to make sure that that gets put into the cumulative impacts assessment.
Very good, thank you. Does any commissioner desire to make a motion then? Commissioner Ackerman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you wouldn't mind, I do have maybe some deliberative comments.
Oh, absolutely.
First, I just wanted to, I've been pondering this application as I've been reading it, and we discussed, and again, as the environment and wildlife seat on the commission, I do tend to focus on wildlife issues. I do want to once again commend this operator and many operators for working very hard to move forward as per our new regulations, and I see progress and I see things that are being done, and I just want to say once again that I appreciate that. As was pointed out by Mr. Dennison, a large portion of this entire development, if you take all 4 OGDPs together, is in pronghorn high priority habitat. And I do think and assume, but also want to state for the record that I believe that operators should look very carefully at these types of situations where we do have blocks of important habitat, and understand the timing stipulations that CPW will generally recommend for those blocks of habitat, and try to put together OGDPs and certainly CAPs and CDPs that would take into account being able to, account for winter timing closures or other important stipulations that are commonly recommended by CPW. I do agree with Commissioner Messner's comment, and I appreciate it very much, that the operator's CAP and application and wildlife plan should definitely address CPW's primary suggested avoidance measures. I know that it's difficult in this situation to solve this issue, but I did find it unsavory, for lack of a better word, that the wildlife plan did not directly address avoidance, which is the primary mitigative measure for wildlife for pronghorn and winter concentration areas, and should definitely address those primary issues and talk more about them without placing COGC staff in the position of having to then follow up and insist that those are included as COAs or other BMPs and follow-ups. And so I hope that this operator and others, as they bring forth other OGDP plans and wildlife plans, will consider that. That said, I don't take lightly language that allows pre-production activity during CPW recommended closure periods. As I've said a number of times, they're very important. As I understand this hearing here today, Noble did commit to plan all of those activities outside of those periods, and did want to allow for leaving a caveat in there that should it become logistically impossible to be able to work with CPW to reassess and come back before the director as another touch point to work out other BMPs, other compensatory mitigation, other wildlife monitoring, or whatever else CPW would recommend. And I appreciate that. I'm significantly moved by the habitat improvements that do result by plugging 89 wells that span across this OGDP2 area, and by cleaning up their attenuating facilities and truck traffic and restoring the habitat associated with those. That's not a small commitment, and I am moved by that. And I do appreciate their continued consultation with CPW and their continued consultation with the director going forward. So that said, Mr. Chair, it's difficult for me when there's HPH involved, and there is a caveat. I do believe avoidance is our best measure. I think the operator has, with the assistance of COGC staff on this occasion, addressed that issue, and I'm okay moving forward with this. Those are my off-the-cuff thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Ackerman. Appreciate those comments. Further deliberative comments? Commissioner Cross, then Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to take this opportunity to make a couple kind of broader comments as well. I think, first of all, I want to comment, and I've made this comment before, but I think it's just highlighting the importance of the CDPs under our previous rules and the caps under our current rules. And this is fully understanding that caps and CDPs are a lot of work. It's a lot of work for the operator. It's also a lot of work for our staff. And that's where I want to also kind of have the second point come in, is I know that the staff has been working hard on this, and I know that the staff and the operator had a lot of work throughout the weekend and trying to make sure that this got done. And so I first off want to try and say a big thank you to everyone for taking that time to work on this, to get it prepared for today's hearing. But I also just want to try and say that while I understand this is a lot of work, I think this is important under our rules. I think this kind of consolidation that was discussed, this kind of landscape level planning, is an important way of meeting the goals set under 181 to try and make sure that we're addressing cumulative impacts. We hear stakeholders often talk about cumulative impacts and try and make sure we're addressing them. And I think this is a fantastic way to do it. I think it's important to make sure that we consolidate locations, that we plan things out, that we have people trying to make, people like the operator here trying to make sure that we're working to make sure that everything is piped out, so there's less emissions, there's less truck traffic. We're taking care of existing facilities and existing wells. As Commissioner Ackerman noted, that kind of reduction of existing legacy wells and facilities is important to wildlife. It's important to the people that live in that area, the farmers, for getting that cleaned up. And so I think overall, this is a great way of not just evaluating, but also addressing cumulative impacts, which is specifically what we're required to do. So again, thank you to the staff for the work on this and making sure it gets done. And also thank you for operators for putting in this additional work as well to make sure that we take efforts like this to have thoughtful planning in what we're working on.
Thank you, Commissioner Cross. Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with everything that my fellow commissioners have stated to now. I'm also appreciative that the operator is using electric drill rig. Again, I think when you're this close to people, albeit folks that are supportive of what's occurring, it's up to us to make sure that we're putting forth our best and trying to protect not just their health, but what's happening nuisance-wise. So I think from a noise perspective and an emissions perspective, that's an important piece for me. And I'm appreciative that they're working with the electric utility provider to make sure that that happens. I'm appreciative of the landscape view to reduce the impact from actual infrastructure. Again, I think allowing the operator to do kind of this landscape look and their ability to set up infrastructure so that we're piping oil, gas, and produced water is minimizing not only the physical footprint, but the footprint from an emissions perspective, and then reducing cumulative impact by P'ing and A'ing these legacy wells, I think, again, is a positive impact for this community that's been impacted for a long time because of this longstanding kind of traditional oil and gas activity in their area. And so I think they've done a good job. And I'm gonna repeat what Commissioner Cross said, which is I know that staff's worked really hard to make sure that what got put in front of us with the operator and working with the operator is the best that they can put forward. And I'm appreciative of everybody pushing themselves to make sure that we're minimizing and avoiding as much as possible the impacts to this community and to habitat. So thank you.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have much else to add except for reemphasizing the intent of CDPs and CAPs as far as looking at landscape level planning and looking at landscape level ways to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to sensitive receptors. And I think avoid ultimately becomes the most important point in there. First avoid, then minimize, and if you can't avoid or minimize, then mitigate. You know, continues in the statement of basis and purpose of our rules. I think from a wildlife perspective, the avoidance and being able to look at how to address impacts to high priority habitat from a landscape level as big as a CDP is something that was committed to by the operator in the approval of their CDP, and particularly in the evergreen nature that the operator has committed to within their CDP. And, you know, I hope to see that continue to travel into these OGDPs at a perhaps more refined level as they get into an OGDP, but still taking into consideration the commitments that were made in the approval of the CDP from a landscape level perspective throughout all of the OGDPs associated with this CDP. And so I think it's important also to this commissioner to acknowledge that while there is some citing that was incorporated by the CDP via Rule 604B2 for citing around RBUs, that does not apply to citing associated with HPHs or wildlife habitat. And so there does have to be strong consideration in alternative location analysis as far as you know, ensuring that the siting of these locations do comply with avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating impacts to wildlife habitat. And I think in this instance it does, particularly with the consolidation of some of the facilities and the minimization of the truck traffic associated with the operations corridor, as well as the elimination of 89 legacy wells associated with that. So I do appreciate that, but I want to make sure that any ALA analysis going forward with future OGDPs associated with this, you know, where there is high priority habitat, does clearly indicate how the siting is associated with that, because there is not that 604B2 siting with high priority habitat. And so that's important to this commissioner. And I do think that having robust information, having all of the BMPs that are necessary that we're seeing here at the hearing incorporated into the application is the best case scenario, rather than having COAs having to be brought in by staff because there is either not enough or incomplete information associated with an application. So I hope that, you know, as we see additional OGDPs with this, that there is an understanding of what the expectation is as far as the information necessary to be provided in the application, so that it doesn't have to be teased out by staff either through constant consultation or COAs associated with a director's recommendation. Having said that, again, I think that this one has a lot of benefits to it from a cumulative impact standpoint. And so I'm fine moving forward with it.
Thank you for those comments. Any final deliberative comments? Seeing none, does a commissioner desire to make a motion? Commissioner Cross?
I'm happy to make a motion. I think I want to make sure that we can, perhaps before making the motion, make sure that we have the points previously discussed just reiterated, so we can make sure that we include all the different the additions that we've talked about.
AG Mercer, thank you for visualizing yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just thought I would try to assist in making sure that we have all of those items listed. So what I've made note of is that the commission would like to add, I believe it is 4 BMPs. One is one that addresses the evergreen nature, so to speak, of the CDP and OGDP, using the identical language that was attached to OGDP number 1. Second is a BMP regarding the timeline under which Noble will P&A the legacy wells in the area. Again, using the identical language as was included in OGDP number 1. Third, I have that there would be a BMP Third, a BMP stating that Noble will use Group 3 drilling fluids at the drilling locations here. And then fourth would be addition of each of the COAs that were proposed in staff's director's recommendation, with the revisions to the wildlife timing stipulations proposed by Noble and agreed to by staff, but with the addition that CPW will be consulted in the event that that there is a need for operations during the winter.
And I just also want to make sure that we're including what Commissioner McGowan brought up about including the emissions data for the cumulative impacts. Okay. Mr. Chair, with that, I'd move for approval of the application with the BMPs AAG Mercer just discussed, the evergreen language used in OGDP 1, the timeline for P&A used in OGDP 1, the Group 3 drilling fluids, the conditions of approval as amended by Noble with the and approved by staff with the inclusion that CPW be consulted, and then finally for the emissions data being included for the cumulative impacts report.
Very good. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Ms. Fulcher, I would like to recognize you. Are you comfortable with the motion as drafted? It's a little bit on the fly, but I think we all understand where we're going, and it'll end up in the order.
I am. Thank you, Chair. I've been taking diligent notes along with AAG Mercer, but I think that this all tracks my understanding of the hearing today on the record, and I'll work with AAG Mercer if we need to just triple check any of this language to make sure it's identical to what was agreed upon last week. But I'm comfortable.
Okay, thank you very much. It's easier doing it this way than actually sort of drafting everything out, and I feel comfortable that you and AAG Mercer will be able to craft language that is acceptable and in confirmation with the motion and the second. Is there further discussion on the motion? Seeing no further discussion, all those commissioners in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The motion as seconded carries. The application OGDP number 2 is approved.
Thank you very much, commissioners. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation, and thank you to the panel, and thank you to staff for their tremendous work to get this to a point for presentation to us. Okay, commissioners, we have just one other matter on our agenda. I would propose we go ahead and just take it up. I don't think it's going to take a ton of time. That is, Commissioner Messner was going to give us an update on the Produced Water Consortium.
Oh.
Commissioner McGowan?
Sorry, I thought we had an enforcement action on the agenda too. Was that part of consent?
I don't have my agenda before me. AAG, Hearings Manager Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner McGowan, that was a recommended order. It was an AOC.
Oh, right.
So if any commissioner had any questions, concerns, we certainly could take it up.
Nope, thank you.
Yep.
You're welcome.
Depending on how long Commissioner Messer needs, I might need a quick bio break, Chair.
Okay, well then let's just do that. Let's take 5 minutes. Let's return at 10:58 or thereabouts, and we will then hear from Commissioner Messer. All right, we are back live. Commissioner Messer, you are recognized for your update.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just a quick update to make sure that everyone understands kind of what's going on with the Produced Water Consortium concept, what we've been doing over the last couple of months, and what some of the anticipated next steps are towards the concept. I don't remember how much information I told you at a previous update, probably through commissioner comments, but so I may repeat myself here a little bit. But I just want to make sure that everyone knows what's happening and that answer any questions that anyone has, and make sure that the commission is supportive of any kind of steps that we may take moving forward. Just a reminder that the concept here is the concept of the Colorado Produced Water Consortium aims to bring regulators, industry, researchers, and non-governmental organizations together to address produced water challenges in the state. This Produced Water Consortium will provide an informed path for the utilization of this water resource, both inside and potentially outside of the oil field. The entity will be housed in a place to be determined, but it will be a collaboration between the different stakeholders, the COGCC and the Colorado School of Mines. The outcome of this effort will build upon Produced Water Consortium efforts nationally, as well as it will identify and address critical scientific and regulatory knowledge gaps needed to develop policies that are protective of public health and the environment in Colorado. And additionally, these policies will ideally provide a path that encourages the oil and gas industry to recycle and reuse their produced water inside the oil field while exploring the potential extent of safely reusing produced water outside the oil field. That was the initial concept, the abstract of where we started with the Produced Water Consortium. We had 2 different working group meetings, somewhere between 35 and 40 participants in each of those working group meetings, discussing the idea of the produced water. Some of the questions that we asked the folks that were participating there is, is a Colorado Produced Water Consortium a good idea? Is it helpful for operators? Is it helpful for regulators? Is it helpful for academics to consider this idea? We heard presentations from the New Mexico Produced Water Consortium, some participants from there, and some of the other folks that were active in the development of Produced Water Consortium for the state of Texas. We had conversations around ideas on the structure and funding of a Produced Water Consortium for the state, and then had some other conversations about different steps that needed to be taken in order to develop a Produced Water Consortium within the state of Colorado. We determined after those initial 2 stakeholder group meetings that there were 3 main areas that we wanted to focus on should we develop a Produced Water Consortium for the state of Colorado. One was the beneficial reuse of produced water outside of the oil field. Perhaps some of the areas of emphasis there would be to guide and plan pilot studies and testing and water quality testing standards for the reuse of produced water outside the oil field. The second main topic was legal and policy guidance around produced water. Some discussions around Colorado water law issues, legal and legislative barriers, and opportunities around the utilization of produced water, and how to use legal, policy, legislative ways to implement and encourage the reuse of produced water. And then the third main topic area was the infield reuse of produced water, the recycling of produced water in oil and gas activities, and some focus areas in that subgroup were water quantities, qualities, infrastructure, and best practices around the recycling of produced water in field. So the next steps on the development of the produced water consortium is to develop these subgroups within the 3 topic areas. And so we've done that now. We've started that step to have 3 different subgroups under the guise of the Colorado Produced Water Consortium, working on those 3 topics. Within those subgroups, those sub-working groups, which will start to occur in a couple of weeks. We hope to have kind of presentations and educations around the particular topic area to make sure that everyone is on the same page regarding the particular topic, evaluate the opportunities and barriers that exist. Each subgroup will develop a plan of action for the topic and the questions that they hope to be answered within that topic area, and then develop a proposed work product, a report, a pilot testing plan, or whatever that particular subgroup decides needs to be the work product associated with that group. The timeline for the sub-working groups and the expected outcomes would be several in-person or online meetings to understand the state of knowledge for Colorado produced water, and then a couple of meetings to determine what exact project or policy guidance or report needed to be developed within there. So we could be looking at, hopefully an actionable item on these topic areas within the next year or so. To give you a little bit of idea of what actions could occur within the working groups, for the beneficial reuse working groups, most likely that's going to be headed by James Rosenblum from the Colorado School of Mines. It would be framing the reuse outside the oil field, some consideration of pilot projects around high salinity areas like the DJ or the Peons, which has 20,000 or more TDS, and then some low salinity pilot projects, perhaps in coal bed methane areas or J-sands areas that have total dissolved solids of less than 1,000. Looking at some different water quality testing concepts and ideas so that can guide and inform regulators and policymakers, and perhaps the development of a pilot project associated with that, with some clear study goals, statement of work, roles and responsibilities, and data sharing plans. For the policy and guidance working group, it would be kind of a deep dive into the legal and policy issues around produced water, understanding Colorado water law, which that's a big topic. So, I mean, as it relates to produced water, to refine that, have some discussions around water rights, tributary versus non-tributary, allowable uses, and really understand the major barriers that currently exist, either from a legal standpoint or a legislative policy standpoint, and try to figure out ways to minimize those barriers to encourage the reuse of produced water in the state of Colorado. Some of the possible outcomes from that policy guidance working group could be a report or suggested guidance or considered legislation on the topic. And then the final working group is the infield reuse working group, which is really trying to understand what's currently being done in different regions around the state associated with produced water, understanding the necessary infrastructure that needs to be in place to enable and encourage reuse, really understanding the current practices, the storage and air quality issues that are associated with them, the water sharing that occurs between operators and what are some of the challenges around that. And then hopefully a potential outcome of that could be a report that details the guidance and practices for in-field reuse around Colorado that could be shared and hopefully become beneficial for operators in the state. Understand that these are initial concepts for all three of the working groups, and in the end, these working groups will decide what their work products are, and to ensure that they really are beneficial to the folks that are participating in the different subgroups associated with the Produced Water Consortium. And that is the general. So what will occur, next steps are over the next few weeks, we'll have the initial subgroup working group meetings that will more clearly define the roles, responsibilities, goals, and objectives of those subgroups, define the work product that is associated with those subgroups, the questions that need to be answered, the concepts that need to be pushed forward. We'll leave it to the work groups to further refine the structure of those particular work groups. And then at some point, once that initial steps are taken to define what the anticipated or hopeful work product would be, to start to develop funding structures around how to accomplish some of the goals that these subgroups come up with. So that's a general update on what has been happening in that world. Do commissioners have any questions about that?
Questions, folks? Great update. Thanks, Commissioner Messner.
All right, I'll keep going then.
Keep continuing. We appreciate it.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Commissioners, I believe that concludes the agendized items for today's meeting. We are meeting tomorrow at 1, I believe, for a Martinez-Irwin update. So we will look forward to seeing everybody then. Between now and then, I think we're looking for a motion to adjourn.
I just want to, Mr. Chair, first, I just want to apologize quickly. I had a little power outage here, which is why I had to switch to my phone. So I apologize that I turned off my camera so I wouldn't look like the Blair Witch Project here on our session. But I do want to say thank you, Commissioner Messner, for that update, and I would move to adjourn.
Great. We have a motion to adjourn. No problem.
Second.
The change to the phone. We have a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 We are adjourned. See everybody tomorrow at 1 o'clock.